Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled that you have joined us for Climate Director Voting by asset managers and proxy advisors in 2023 and what their clients can do about it. A webinar about Majority Action's recently published report, Climate in the Boardroom 2023. My name is Laura De Palma, and I am a Senior Investor Engagement Specialist at Majority Action. We are thrilled to have you join us today. Before we get started with our presentation, I will go over some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared after the webinar. Closed captioning is enabled. If needed, please click the Show Captions option in the Zoom controls toolbar. Slides and links to materials will be shared after the webinar. Please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will answer them after the presentation and during the Q&A section of the webinar. I am pleased to introduce our speakers. To begin, Jason Opeña-Disterhoff, Senior Investor Engagement Specialist at Majority Action, will share some context and background. Then, Bryant Sewell, Senior Research Analyst at Majority Action and primary author of our Climate in the Boardroom 2023 report, will present the key findings of the report and answer questions. We are honored to have Juan Pablo Martinez, Senior ESG Specialist at Irish Life Investment Managers, speak about proxy voting as it relates to fiduciary duty and how clients can engage their managers on an ongoing basis. Juan Pablo is responsible for Irish Life Investment Managers' net zero stewardship strategy and supports the firm's engagement, proxy voting, and ESG product integration activities. Now, my colleague Jason will present context and background information.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to all of you for joining. Just a few brief words of introduction from me before I hand things over to my colleague Bryant. First piece of context. We are releasing this report in the midst of an unprecedented climate year, one in which the material risks that climate change represents have started to crystallize. Next slide, please. This is the 5th edition of this annual report, and we've continued to iterate. With that, next slide. Just want to run through some basics about the report. It analyzes climate proxy voting, in particular holding directors accountable at climate laggard issuers with a focus on votes and vote recommendations in the last proxy season and also analyzing proxy voting policies. This year, we looked at the 16 largest global asset managers and added the 2 major proxy advisors. That's new this year. Issuer scope is narrower. It's 17 US issuers in climate critical sectors, and it is only those misaligned on key climate performance criteria. Bryant will run through more of that detail. The key voting metric has also been revised. We're looking at support for full boards at these companies. The logic being support for a full board is an endorsement of an issuer's overall strategy and therefore its climate strategy. And finally, we've refined the analysis we use for the proxy voting policies, looking at public expectations that investors set out and how tightly they tie to director accountability. Next slide. Finally, we're seeing in the investor ecosystem a recognition that director voting can be one piece, a complementary piece of a comprehensive stewardship strategy. And with that, I'll hand things over to Bryant. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Picking up where Jason just handed off the transition, I want to point out that Majority Action helps shareholders exercise their proxy voting power by evaluating climate disclosures of laggards in the energy and utility sector to closely align CA100 plus indicators. And we then issue company-specific vote guidance against directors responsible for climate oversight at the most 1.5C misaligned companies. So on this chart here, you'll see those indicators in the areas of target setting, CapEx, and policy influence are in the top rows, and recommendations for US-based CA100 plus utilities are in the far right column. I want to emphasize that some utilities have made limited progress towards decarbonization. Therefore, we did not recommend against those issuers. And you can see that as designated again in that far right column. Next slide, please. So switching over to the energy sector, the key takeaway here is that progress on decarbonization at US-based oil and gas companies has completely stalled. And so therefore we recommended votes against directors at each of these companies, again, US-based CA100 plus focus companies, for the failure to set adequate targets, let alone align CapEx and policy influence to a 1.5C trajectory. Next slide, please. Similarly, we started with a long list of climate critical companies in the financial services sector and made recommendations to vote against directors for companies with worse than class finance emission reduction targets and fossil fuel exclusion policies. And so this is specific to the banking sector and the insurance industry. So in total, Majority Action issued no vote recommendations at 17 US-based companies. And this table measures the extent to which asset managers did not support the full board of those 17 companies with operations and business models that were most misaligned with the 1.5C pathway during the 2023 proxy season. 3 asset managers, Amundi, Franklin Templeton, and Elgin, stood out for their leadership in using proxy voting to hold directors of companies vital to the net zero transition accountable. Conversely, the 4 largest and most influential asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity, provided overwhelming support to the directors of these same companies. I want to highlight the fact that Vanguard and Fidelity actually did not vote against a single director at any of these climate critical companies, any of these 17 climate critical companies. So I also want to note that this year we included proxy advisors, as Jason mentioned earlier, in our analysis and found ISS's US benchmark recommendations were more management aligned than all but 4 of the 16 asset managers analyzed. Next slide, please. So this very similar looking chart actually measures the number of times that asset managers voted against at least one board director at each of the 6 climate critical companies without a net zero by 2050 ambition. After years of engagement, any company failing to achieve even partial compliance with the net zero by 2050 criteria represents a direct impediment to avoiding the worst effects of climate change. Yet 10 of the largest asset managers supported the entire board at the majority of these companies, as you can see here. And again, Fidelity and Vanguard, as I mentioned earlier, supported every director at each of these companies flagged for not having a net zero ambition. Next slide, please. I just want to emphasize that director voting has emerged as a key stewardship lever for mitigating climate risk. And the best practice in proxy voting policies has crystallized around 2 key elements. First, portfolio company expectations, and second, board accountability. So this chart actually evaluates asset manager and proxy advisors 2023 proxy season voting policies in those critical areas. So please note that portfolio company expectations encompass net zero commitments, medium-term targets, and CapEx and policy influence alignment, as you can see in the top row of this chart. And the key takeaway here is that while most proxy voting policies analyzed at least partially recognize the need for board accountability at companies that did not meet climate performance expectations, as seen in the far right column, indicated by the yellow and green shaded boxes. The overwhelming majority of these expectations were so low as to rarely trigger a vote against the director. And that's it. I will turn it over to back to Laura for questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lisa Lindsley, the Director of Investor Engagement at Majority Action, and now we will take your questions. So please drop any questions you have in the Q&A box. The first question we're going to cover is, Since this is your 5th annual asset manager voting report, have any of the asset managers in scope improved in their voting? And if so, what has caused their improvement on proxy voting? And I think it'd be interesting to also take a look at what the shifts we've seen in terms of director support at fossil fuel critical companies. Bryant, is this one that you can handle? You're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. I want to start by stating that our assertion is that voting behavior is derived from proxy voting policy, and we've actually seen over the long term a shift towards, in particular, director accountability for climate oversight with respect to asset managers and their proxy voting policies. So that far right column that I mentioned in the prior slide, where we were talking about director accountability, and at least generally or in under certain circumstances, voting against directors that are failing in climate oversight at these climate critical companies, we have seen an emergence of those policies now being updated to include that aspect around director accountability. And that has translated into an increase in votes against directors. We did an analysis at the end of the proxy season and actually noted that support for directors in these critical industries, particularly oil and gas and utilities, when they're aggregated together, we've seen a steady decrease in support at these, in particular, 17 climate critical companies. So yes, I would say in the long-term trajectory, we've seen movement and progress in the right direction. A lot of that, is based upon the efforts and accountability measures that like folks here on this call have been putting in place.
Great, and I would add that it's due to the leadership of asset owners who have adopted forward-thinking proxy voting policies and also engaged in dialogue with their asset managers about how best to mitigate the systemic risk of climate change that's resulted in these shifts that we've seen over the 5 years of doing this report. So another question that we've received is, could you say more about what issuers these asset managers and proxy advisors did and did not hold accountable and why? Jason, do you want to start us off with this one?
Sure, happy to kick things off. There are two issuers in our set of 17 that really stand out in terms of these asset managers and proxy advisors holding directors accountable at them, and those are Berkshire Hathaway and Kinder Morgan, which were the only two at which a majority of these players held directors accountable. And rightly so. They are misaligned on multiple climate performance criteria, including neither of them having comprehensive net zero ambitions, which really in 2023 is absolute table stakes, just that affirmation of the kind of overall direction of travel in terms of decarbonization. It is really striking, though, to look at the other 4 issuers that also don't have net zero ambitions, according to the C100 plus benchmark. So those are Chevron, Marathon Petroleum, Phillips 66, Valero, and less than a third of asset managers and proxy advisors held directors accountable at any of those companies. And in the case of Chevron, it was less than a quarter of those asset managers and proxy advisors. So we continue to really see a disconnect between even the most basic aspects of climate performance and holding directors accountable for that misalignment. And that's something we we need these, major players in the investor ecosystem to continue to improve on.
I think it'd be great, just as a follow-up to that question, to talk a little bit about, Bryant, maybe you can talk about the companies that were initially on our list, and then for greater scrutiny because of their contribution to climate change. And then we took them off the list and did not make recommendations against directors.
Yes, so this occurred particularly in the utilities and financial services sector. There were companies that had made progress towards alignment with the 1.5C pathway with respect to target setting, CapEx alignment, and policy influence. And so, as I mentioned before, the impetus to vote against directors was removed based on that, on those improvements. And in particular at the utilities, we saw organizations like PPL better align their policy influence disclosures and engagement activities. Duke Energy took steps forward with respect to Scope 3 emissions, not only for the net zero target, but also for their medium-term targets. So we saw also companies in the financial services sector like Chubb and Wells Fargo make progress with respect to their medium-term targets for financed emissions, or for in Chubb's case, setting a net zero ambition and updating their exclusion policies to be more stringent. And again, this is limited progress. So we don't want to highlight these companies as being in full alignment with the pathway that we need to transition our economy, to decarbonize our economy. But we do want to acknowledge that there are companies, based on these metrics and indicators that have been developed by CA100 Plus, that are now universally accepted by by investors. There are companies that have been making progress with respect to those indicators, and we are singularly focused on directing investors' attention to the worst performing companies, the laggards of these worst performing companies, of these poorly performing companies, but also acknowledge when companies make progress. It is something that we do acknowledge. So we take that pragmatic approach to our vote guides and recommendations against directors.
Great, thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for putting in questions. So the next question we're gonna cover is, what confidence does Majority Action have in the notion that the votes against directors from the highlighted asset managers are due to poor climate risk management, as opposed to some other governance or risk oversight concern? So I will kick this off and say that we don't always know, although we do study the rationales that are listed for votes, and there is an increasing percentage of asset managers who are disclosing their rationales and including climate in their rationale to vote against directors. When Majority Action, along with several large asset owners, launched the Proxy Voting for a 1.5 Degree World initiative, we did it in the philosophy that behind the failings of systemically important emitters and their enablers, behind their failure to set targets, have capital expenditure plans consistent with those targets, and have political spending consistent with targets to reduce their emissions, was a failure of governance overall. And so it's no surprise that the same companies that have climate failures also have other governance problems, and we don't think that that's inconsistent. So I'll pause there and see if Bryant, Jason, or Juan Pablo, or Laura would like to add anything.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. I think the one thing I would add is it's worth considering sort of the the converse of this question, and that is to say, even though we don't have full availability of rationales, and do encourage publishing rationales as a best practice, but a vote for the full board of any given issuer is an endorsement of that issuer's overall strategy, including its climate strategy. So, for example, the 12 asset managers in scope of this report who voted for the full board at Chevron, all that is a rubber stamp of the overall strategy, including the climate strategy of Chevron. So that flip side, I think, is worth considering as well.
Thanks, that's a great point. Okay, I'm going to speed through a couple of questions so we can try to get to them all. So the next one is, which board directors do you recommend that investors vote against, and does this depend on the company? And we have had a hierarchy of directors depending on a number of different factors that we didn't cover in the presentation today. And maybe we can follow up with you about that. This question was asked anonymously. And I want to make clear that climate in the boardroom, the analysis of climate in the boardroom, wasn't based on did the asset manager vote against the directors that we recommended. It was based on did the asset manager oppose any director at this company. And so, for the purposes of the report, and as Jason just said, the endorsement of these company strategies, that's the lens through which to view it. But yeah, it would be helpful. We would be happy to follow up with this question. It's a little bit of a longer answer. The next question is there a connection between financial performance and asset manager reluctance to vote against directors at these companies? I would say yes. We find that many U.S. asset managers are still taking a case-by-case approach on their proxy voting, as opposed to setting performance standards that they expect companies to live up to, and then casting their votes accordingly. But do any of the panelists want to add anything there? Okay. So the next question is, we just have one more minute for Q&A. Given the sluggish pace of change, does this show us that director votes as a lever should be deprioritized compared to pushing for government-mandated, Paris-aligned business models and other external mechanisms? So we're trying to work with, our mission is to support asset owners to mitigate systemic risks using the tools that they have at hand, which is their proxy voting and their relationships as clients of asset managers and proxy advisors. We're not averse to having to the role of government, and I think that because we focus on U.S. large cap companies, we have to be realistic about what's possible in the wake of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision and the political influence of those companies. So I think with that, we're going to wrap, and thank you. We'll follow up with with Jay and Julian. Thank you for putting your names in your questions so we can follow up with you. And now is my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Juan Pablo Martinez.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'd just like to speak now. I think there was a slide. I'm not sure if I can see it. Yeah, that one. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, I just like to give a few points just from an asset manager's perspective of how important it is as a client to be having these conversations with asset managers. And first of all, the really biggest point here is how important and how big the influence of the largest asset managers is. So just the big three alone, they hold a median stake of almost 22% in the S&P 500, and they would be the largest owners in 88% of the S&P 500. And almost largest owners in around 40% of US publicly listed companies. So their influence is massive. So, you know, if you're a client of any of these asset managers, it's very important to be having these conversations with them, because there's definitely a link to, you know, how they make their decisions, and, you know, how they're influenced by clients is super, super important. So I can speak from a company's experience that the influence that our clients have had in us moving towards more progressive stances on climate and towards more climate aligned positions was very, very significant. Obviously, there's lots of intentions, but without the clients, you cannot really move it. So you definitely need to be pressing these clients. It's super, super important. And just, it's one of the important things to highlight to these asset managers is that it's just a simple element of their fiduciary duty. So what asset managers need to be doing is using all of their powers they have as shareholders, given that they're shareholders in, you know, 22% of the S&P 500. They really need to be proper stewards of the capital, and they really need to be managing this long term, because, you know, as they're primarily index investors, they'll be investing for, you know, a very long term. And, you know, you need to be properly managing these investments on behalf of your clients. Given its long-term investments, they're particularly exposed to systemic risks. Climate change, you know, is a particular risk that could affect all of the different investments that they hold. So it's particularly important that they should be using all of the levers that they have available for change, and voting against directors that are not doing sufficiently, you know, to actually make any change in these companies and to properly drive the transition is, you know, something that they really need to be targeting. And what the most important message that I should highlight is that, you know, as clients of these asset managers, you really need to help them understand the stewardship is key to them having continued investment and, you know, to continuing to attract assets, you know, because otherwise it's a failure of their fiduciary duty to not be properly acting on the client's business interests, for mitigating systemic risks, for driving change in these companies, and for generating proper returns for the long term. Thank you very much. Now I will pass it to Laura again.
Thanks so much for your leadership and important and thoughtful remarks, Juan Pablo. Now we are going to launch 2 sets of poll questions. You should see the first one on your screen right now. It would be greatly appreciated if you could take a moment and answer the questions. While you are doing that, I will review key recommendations around how to use the report. We recommend that everyone, especially clients and investors, use this report and share the link with your colleagues and networks. If you are a client, you can send the link of the report to your managers. You can also, if you are a client, ask your managers for a meeting to discuss the report's key findings and recommendations. For all clients and investors, we invite you to sign up for the Climate in the Boardroom workshop for clients to learn how to use the report as a tool during their meetings with managers. You may sign up by filling out the poll question or sending me an email. My email will be in the chat for anyone who wants to reach out and reserve a seat at our upcoming investor-only workshop. And everybody here can schedule a one-to-one meeting with Majority Action's investor engagement team to discuss the report in greater detail and share the link widely with your networks. Now we are going to launch the second poll. This is our last poll during the webinar. And again, we would greatly appreciate if you could take a minute to fill it out. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will send the link to the recording, slide deck, and other materials in a follow-up email soon. If you want to schedule a meeting with Majority Action's investor engagement team, please email us at investors@majorityact.org. We look forward to continuing to engage in this important discussion and to continue to use this report to engage managers. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, your questions, and your participation, and we hope to connect with you soon.